Why Nations Fail: The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty is a book that helped to understand the inequality of this world by asking the question, why some nations are rich and others are poor. This book was written by the economists Daron, Acemoğlu, and James Robinson and was first published in 2012. The theory of this book stipulates that the interaction of political and economic institutions is causing poverty when they are extractive and prosperity when they are inclusive. In the preface, Acemoğlu and Robinson advanced the idea that countries such as Great Britain and the United States became rich because their citizens overthrew the elites who controlled power and created a society where political rights were much more broadly distributed, where the government was accountable and responsive to citizens, and where the great mass of people could take advantage of economic opportunities. This observation is the central idea of the book, which will be analyzed and illustrated by many case studies and examples. Many people associate the achievement of prosperity and wealth with labor exploitation, colonization, child labor, or slavery. The authors reject this perception first by citing the example of the Spanish conquistadors' exploitation of Latin Americans. Spanish conquistadors exploited the Latin Americans by forcing them to work, offering them low wages, imposing high taxes, and charging them high prices for goods. While the Spanish crown, conquistadors, and their descendants generated a lot of wealth from this exploitation, Latin America turned into the most unequal continent in the world. For Acemoglu and Robinson, prosperity is not linked to culture as some people believe and as some intellectuals theorize, such as Max Weber, who argued that Protestant ethic played a key role in fossilizing the rise of modern industrial society in Western Europe. What makes the economy work for everybody is the politics. To illustrate this hypothesis, the authors compared between several countries. For instance, if the prosperity and wealth are radically different between North Korea and South Korea, it is because these two countries have two different types of political and economic institutions. The two key concepts that structure this book are extractive institutions and inclusive institutions. Extractive institutions exclude most citizens from political and economic decisions. Wealth is concentrated in the hand of some individuals or entities. In this type of institutions, growth is possible when elites can directly allocate resources to high productivity activities that they themselves control. That is to say that innovation is not encouraged and broadly permitted because of the fear of creative destruction. For instance, the Soviet Union was able to generate rapid growth even under extractive institutions. But, as in all instances of growth under extractive institutions, this growth did not include technological change and was not sustainable. Consequently, growth first slowed down and then totally collapsed. There are other reasons why growth under extractive institutions is limited. The history of the Maya city-state exemplifies how instability and infighting are inherent features of extractive institutions that reverse any political centralization, leading to chaos. Inclusive institutions, on the other hand, include a large number of citizens in economic activities to make the best use of their skills and talents. Private property is the best illustration of inclusive economy in a sense that it permits people to achieve success and prosperity. Inclusive institutions secure property rights and an unbiased system of law which make people exchange and create safely. Democracy is the heart of wealth and prosperity. The United States, for example, showed early signs of democratic institutions. By the 1720s, each American colony had a governor and an assembly based on a franchise of male property holders. Although this social organization could not be called a democracy because women, slaves, and the propertyless could not vote, but political rights were very broad compared with contemporary societies elsewhere. These assemblies and their leaders coalesced to form the First Continental Congress in 1774, the beginning of the independence of the United States. In the beginning of the 20th century, the United States witnessed the development of an important number of banks, assets, and competition. This economic model guaranteed equal access to finance and loans and ensured that those with ideas and inventions could benefit from them. Inclusive institutions are not the same in all societies. Their democratic principles vary due to historical differences, the roles of individuals, or just random factors. The rise of inclusive institutions is not a predetermined process. Feudalism spread throughout most of Europe, West and East, after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Thereafter, the Black Death, Western and Eastern Europe began to radically diverge. These diversions was about small changes that led Western Europe to improvement in the balance of power and Eastern Europe to institutional deterioration. Each prosperous country has a different experience of inclusive institutions. The same revolutions that shook England during the Civil War and then the Glorious Revolution were not needed in the United States or Australia due to the different circumstances in which these countries were founded. Of course, this does not mean that the conflict didn't take place in the process of the establishment of inclusive institutions in these countries. We know that the United States had to throw away British colonization in 1776. But the history of England with inclusive institutions is much more confrontational because of its long history of absolutist rule. A comparison today between England and Ethiopia spans word inequality. Unlike England, Ethiopia's absolutism persisted until the recent past, which led to extreme poverty. Also, Ethiopia has failed to take advantages of industrial advances that were made during the 19th and early 20th centuries, intensified poverty of its citizens today. The same observation applies to Somalis who were feuding and fending for their lives instead of taking part of the industrialization process. Therefore, if word inequality exists today, it is because some nations were able to take advantage of the Industrial Revolution and the technologies and methods of organization, while others were unable to do. This failure was due to their extractive institutions, either a consequence of the persistence of their absolutist regimes or because they lacked centralized states. However, in several instances, the extractive institutions that underpin the poverty of these nations were imposed or intensified by European commercial and colonial expansion. The authors say that the growth of European colonial empires was often built on the destruction of independent politics and indigenous economies around the world, or on the creation of extractive institutions, essentially from the ground up, as in the Caribbean islands, where following the almost total collapse of the native populations, Europeans imported African slaves and set up plantation systems. Inclusive institutions are pluralistic. This characteristic makes usurpation much more difficult. The authors mention the example of Franklin Roosevelt when he tried to remove the checks on his power imposed by the Supreme Court, and also the example of Sir Robert Walpole when he attempted to summarily implement the Black Act. In both cases, the attempts to concentrate power in the hands of an individual or a narrow group were doomed because of political pluralism. Why nations fail today? Based on the book's analysis, the shortest answer would be extractive institutions. Countries fail not because of their geography or their culture, but because of the legacy of extractive institutions which concentrate power and wealth in the hands of few. Zimbabwe, for instance, illustrate how dictatorship opened the way for unrest and poverty. By 2008, Zimbabwe per capita income was about half of what it was when the country gained its independence in 1980. Botswana, on the other hand, achieved a remarkable growth rate after independence because it was led by leaders who drove the country onto a path of inclusive economic and political institutions. Consequently, there is no historical determinism behind the poverty or the prosperity of nations. What it is needed is inclusive institutions to break the vicious cycle of inclusive institutions. Foreign aids can be used to facilitate such development and to empower a broad segment of population. Media and social media can also help in the transition towards inclusive institutions only when citizens are mobilized and organized to effectively change the politics. Again, many small differences are needed to create the path towards inclusive economic and political institutions. Why Nations Fell, The Origins of Power, Prosperity and Poverty is a very rich book that provides a clear analysis of how political and economic institutions interact in causing poverty or prosperity, and how different parts of the world ended up with such a different sets of institutions. However, several limits can be detected in this intellectual work. The overfocus on the concepts of inclusive and exclusive institutions put away other significant factors that interfere in the spread of poverty and prosperity. No geopolitical analysis was proposed, especially when the authors are aware of the role of colonial expansion in intensifying poverty and inequality around the world. Also, there is no reflection on the crisis or the possible fall of inclusive institutions. Such a thinking requires prospective scientific knowledge.